My name's ALLAN McKAY. I'm a visual effects supervisor in the US. I'm originally from Australia. I've worked on a lot of projects like Transformers, Superman, The Last Airbender, The Equalizer, 2012, a lot of different films, as well as video game projects too. So BioShock, Destiny, Halo, Call of Duty, things like that as well. And yeah, I've been doing this for about 20 years, worked at ILM, Blur, all the big studios, and Activision, Ubisoft as well, things like that. It really depends. For me, I feel like it's always good to stay relevant, so I always want to make sure I'm still doing the work and I know what I'm doing. And usually a CG supervisor is someone that would be on site, making sure that everyone's doing their work, and that means that you can either supervise or you can be in the trenches as well. VFX, usually it's more to do with being on set and making sure everything's filmed correctly, so that way you have that chance to make sure everyone's got everything they need, so that way they can do what their work is. But I like to mix it up. I like for me to be able to move around. I feel like visual effects is one of the rare industries that you can be a producer one day, you can be directing a commercial, you could be animating, you could be doing effects, you can be doing video games, you can be doing so many different things. And so I've always enjoyed that, where I kind of, even though I will work on set and make sure that feature films are shot right and we've budgeted everything, we've planned it all out, we've done everything we want to do, I still want to be able to do the work too, and I kind of mix it up, and that way it's a bit of a vacation from being on the box. I'll be on set. Then when I want to get away and get more hands-on, get back in the trenches, it's the opportunity to do that as well. I started out in the 90s, and I feel like everyone is going to be like, I watched Terminator 2 and I watched Jurassic Park and it changed my whole life. And it was those films. I don't think at the time it really registered what I was seeing, but it had a massive impact. I think I always wanted to work in video games when I was a teenager, and even though I loved playing them, I was always fascinated by how to make them as well, how to change things, how to put my artwork into them. I was always an artist growing up, and I felt like it was an evolution was to go onto the computer, you know. And I could be nerdy and say that also I think the limitations of what we had back then, like multimedia, meant that if you played a video game and actually was able to speak, or that had music and good sound effects, then you'd be like, wow. Like, so being able to do shiny graphics that I couldn't paint, things like that were always just like the next step I wanted to learn. So I got into doing like 2D pixel by pixel, frame by frame animation. I was talking with Neil Blevins is doing a talk right now, and he was talking about that in the beginning, which I could relate to. Yeah, it's for me, it was just like the evolution was doing 2D work, and then getting into 3D was the next step, and kind of evolving. And for me, whenever there was something that was difficult to do or you couldn't do in 3D yet, that's where I really kind of accepted the challenge of wanting to learn it. So that's why effects like creating clouds, creating fire, breaking stuff, things that are not usually straightforward to do, that's where I obsessed about them, because I wanted to find a solution for it, and that kind of took me down this kind of rabbit hole of wanting to figure out the things that weren't possible. It really depends. I mean, I think that any good artist is always going to reference the real world, whether you're painting, whether you're doing anything. And when it comes to doing realistic film work, usually the goal is always going to be to make it real, make it seamless, and make it something that works in the real world. And for doing that, you really need to understand the real world. So a lot of times we'll use real shots, like we'll go out and shoot real footage or use elements. Other times we will reference that stuff specifically just to make our work better if we're not using it directly in there. But yeah, I mean, everything I do, I'm always basing it on reality. You start in reality and then you go from there. So I think that everything we do in Hollywood isn't real, but we start in that world and then we start to take it to where we find it more exciting. We get hyper real. When I first started out, especially when like back in the day, you couldn't do any of these things, and that's I guess why I obsessed about them. But like, it made me want to try and figure out like how to get there, because mostly what 3D was always about was polygons. So it meant like hard surface things. You got these eggshells that are a character or a car or a building, and you go and take a cloud. A cloud is not a solid object, and you got to go and mimic that. And so clouds were a stationary thing. They were volumetrics, and so these things were very difficult to do. No one really understood them, and it was kind of like the evolution. Like, bit by bit, we kind of worked our way there. Doing fire, doing explosions, things like that was the holy grail, just because there's a lot of complexity underneath that is not just like a shape. It's the motion, it's the feel of it. It's a light source. Fire doesn't receive a shadow. It generates light, and because of that, like, yeah, it's been very difficult. And for me, very early on, I obsessed about that. I was a bit of a pyromaniac because of it, but it meant that yeah, I I wanted to perfect that, and bit by bit we would get there. We would start doing particles, which would be giant spheres of puffiness that would, assemble something that might explode out, but it wouldn't have the rolling, it wouldn't have the heat and the gas and all the interactions. And over time, like that's where the science and the art meet, is that you need to be creative, you need to be artistic in what you're doing, but you also need to be able to handle the science, the math, and have a lot of control in simulating this stuff that usually, it's not as easy as just keyframing something like animators would. Like there's movies like The Equalizer, where Denzel Washington, he goes into a bar and he kills all the guys in there and he leaves, and Denzel didn't want to get dirty, he didn't want to get blood all over him, so instead we were challenged with having to recreate all the blood and the stabbing. Whenever he killed someone with a corkscrew or a shot glass or anything he did, I would need to go and simulate fluids to actually create the blood. And that's something where you don't think about it. It's like, well, we're doing something creative, but we're using real science to simulate something that at least looks like fluid and acts like fluid. And same thing with fire and explosions. It's all the science behind it that we're then trying to wield underneath the role of being an artist. So it's a lot of back and forth trying to balance the two. Sometimes it's good because it means that you've got creative freedom rather than doing something that's very specific and people know what it is. I've worked on projects where people know it so well, and because of that, it means if you mess up, you don't make it accurate, then people are always going to compare it. Whereas doing something where it's completely new, it means that you are taking on a new challenge, but it also means that you may have a bit of leeway in terms of how you go about it or how it's going to look. It's always going to be challenging taking on new projects, especially when it's something different that people might know how to go about it, because you're going to need to figure it out for yourself. It hasn't been pre-established, like this is the path to go. And that's where I've always enjoyed it, is like looking at a challenge and figuring out how you're going to do it. Usually when you're budgeting a project, you would do like R&D phase, which means you would have the research and development phase where maybe you spend an extra 2 weeks initially trying to figure it out, and you have a lot of back and forth with the director trying to say, is this right? Is this what you want? Trying to figure out the process not only of how it's going to look, but also how the hell are you actually going to pull it off. So it's always a challenge, but in a way it's kind of fun to kind of break new ground in an area that hasn't been done before. I'm one of those people that if you say what kind of projects you've worked on, I'm like, I'm gonna have to bring up IMDb because I can't remember what I've even worked on. So I always have the paralysis by analysis. Like there's been so many projects, off the top of my head, I'm like, where do I begin? But I mean, there's been times where it's like we want to have a 300-foot tornado or a mile-long tornado. It's like, okay, I've never seen one before. What does that look like? Superman Returns was one where it's kind of different. We wanted to take the opening sequence of Superman 1 and rebuild it for modern day effects. So we'd blow up the sun, have the sun implode and then explode and then destroy Krypton and do these amazing things. We had like 3 weeks to do this entire 3-minute sequence, one shot, and trying to figure out how does the sun look when it's going to explode, trying to come up with those ideas on the spot and trying to figure out what you envision it to be, but also what the director is going to envision it to be, because you don't want to go too far in the wrong direction because it's twice as much work to get back to where you need to be. There's been so many projects along the way that I've had no idea when I'm going in how it's going to look. I remember I was on set in Baton Rouge down in Louisiana. I got a call from the studio in New York and they're like, yeah, we're going to shoot something in LA and it's going to be, it was for God of War for the Super Bowl. It was this commercial where they want to have Kratos, which was this video game character who had never been made as a live action character before, and everyone was always eager to see what that would be like, because imagine if they made a movie and this character has a really strong presence to him. So there's this moment where I get sent these boards where it's basically he's with his daughter, his wife, and he's about to go off and lead this army, very similar to 300. And there's this moment where it all turns to ash. His whole entire world kind of falls apart, and it's very symbolic of him being in his own personal hell. It isn't about what's happening around him. It's representing his whole world just falling apart and going to dismay. And so when you get these boards where it's just a black and white image of a little girl, he's holding his daughter, and she starts to turn to ash as the whole world around him starts to fall apart and break apart around him too. It looks really cool on a piece of paper with some black and white sketches, but it's just how the hell are we going to pull that off? This is something that I'd never really seen done well ever, and at the same time, it was something that I wanted to make special and make it stand out. Especially, it's going to be shown at the Super Bowl, like the biggest audience you ever have on the planet. So to try and pull that off, it was just like, all right, we're going to have to hit the ground running and make sure that everything we do is exceptional. No one's going to be on YouTube crapping all over your work. And at the same time, like I had no idea how we're going to even start it, let alone pull it off. And the technology, the duration of doing a project, like we would be doing it and realizing that we're not going to be able to even generate, like render or simulate the images, the fracturing, the dynamics, all the bits and pieces by our deadline, just because there's not enough computer power and like all these other like fundamentals that would have to come together to allow us to actually pull it off. Those are the sorts of projects that are nightmares, but when you actually manage to pull it off, then you're twice as proud of it, because it's just like, yeah, we didn't even know if we could do it, and here we are at the finish line. I just gave a talk just now about like 20 years of failing, and for me it was about learning to go down one path, just to be able to say, okay, great, now we know not to go down this path. It's going to take a lot of failure before you figure it all out, but that's part of the process. And I referenced Edison with the light bulb, but he had his phrase of or saying that it wasn't that I'm going to misquote it, but essentially it took me 10,000 tries to figure out that this wasn't the way before I could find the right way. Essentially is the summary of it. But we all have those moments where we need to do a bunch of essentially failures to be able to get that success. But that is just our path. It isn't something where you can see it as a failure, but more, all right, I did this, and now I know to do that. So with everything I do, it's all about failure. But that's why I wanted to do a talk on it, because I wanted people to realize like that is part of the process. It's not something to shy away from. I think most people, they hesitate to actually ever try something because fear of failure. They're afraid that like, well, if I do it, I may not succeed. And I always say that if you don't try it, then you're 100% not going to succeed. So, it's up to you whether you want to risk it or not. But I think that the people who are willing to fail, get up and try again are the ones who are going to eventually get there. And yeah, I just think that we all need to kind of get out of our comfort zone and push ourselves to actually get to that point. It always depends on the type of project I'm on. I've always been known for someone who comes at the very end and puts out all the fires, just because I like stress, and most people, they're very comfortable having a long-term job, like 6 months on a project, whereas I like to come in at the very end usually, and when the shit's hit the fan, that's when, that's a chance for me to come in and go do crazy hours, a lot of stress, but figure out solutions to a lot of problems that we've kind of hit a wall with. And I've always enjoyed that. And it's only been more in the last 10 years that I've started to enjoy the pre-production process and the development cycle as well, just because I liked the turmoil, the turbulence all at the end, that I was jumped from fire to fire to fire and just kind of enjoy this frenzy. But more recently, I've kind of enjoyed the fact that you can come on set on a project, figuring out like how we're going to pull it off, who we're going to need to get this to actually happen, building teams and knowing how to nurture the right people to take something and be able to run with it. I like working by myself, but I love working with a good team. And I think that when you do find the right people, and I think this is true for everyone, when you do find the right people, you stick with them for the rest of your life. You keep using the same team, and bit by bit, you continue to assemble like the A-team, and you roll from project to project, and you can knock it all out, and you work so well, you know each other's strengths and weaknesses, so you're able to all play on that together. So I think it's really critical when you do find that to kind of stick with it. And but at the same time, like, I guess I have a few different modes of how I'll work, from the turbulence to the pre-production to having a team of people and doing those nurture projects. And those are the ones that I always look back and I'm the proudest of the most. I think that there's for me, I always started teaching people because I was in the 90s where we didn't have a solution. It's like I said, how do you build an explosion? I wanted to figure it out. I was always obsessed with anything that wasn't already figured out back then. And I feel like now we're at a point where we've figured out a lot, and we're just revising and tweaking that a lot more and perfecting it. But for me, it was new ground, and I just wanted to do it because I didn't know how to do it. But then I didn't want other people to go the same path as I did, where they would have to go through the pain of like, how the hell do you do a tornado or whatever it might be? So that to me was always the fun of exploring new ground, but I also wanted to give back. I wanted other people to learn from my mistakes and eventual success. And at the same time, like I knew so many people back then who, you'd walk past the desk and they're doing something in Photoshop. You're like, man, that looks great. How'd you do it? You know, and they're like, I'm not going to tell you. Like, why would I share my secrets? And that always pissed me off. It made me want to do the opposite. Like, okay, well, great. I want to share everything because I don't have to cling on to this. I don't have to worry about my one or two tricks. And I think that along the way, I think it's really powerful when you do start sharing, because in a way, for you to share information with other people, you got to start looking at it a very different way that you might have before. You might have figured something out, and on the surface, you're like, I get it. But when you need to regurgitate that information, translate it to other people, then you got to break it down further and really understand it yourself. So in a way, I'm doing a favor to me by the more I share, the more I really have to absorb it properly before I can share it. And so it's made me a better artist, and you know, I've had a lot of growth because I've had to really be able to understand something and then be able to give it to other people, and that's going to help me get better at what I'm doing as well. There's so much tech coming out. We got 3D body scanning and all these other things that allow us to, you know, capture information, on-set actors, and be able to get really accurate representations that I've always found that that's really fascinating. Be able to have like digital characters, you couldn't even tell the difference. And even recently with movies like Logan, Star Wars, you know, you've got actual digital characters where you're even for a second being like, there's something weird about this, I'm not quite sure where it is, opposed to that's a CG character, you know. And I think that that's really amazing. Like, that's where we're heading. I think that shooting on set, doing augmented reality, real-time motion capture, all these different things, that is really fascinating, just because it means that even though you're doing something virtual, you don't need to go back and say, okay, great, we'll be back in a week with some stuff to show. You literally can be shooting something, and someone looking through the viewfinder can actually see the environment or see the character or see something to show the final result. And it's real time. It means that you have that one step away from actors actually being able to interact on set with another person or another character or another thing. And it's pretty seamless that way. So I love VR. I think augmented reality is really where things are going to go, just because it changes everything for us in terms of how we're going to interact, not just in film, but just in day-to-day stuff. So that's obviously one of the big ones that is changing us right now and how we're doing things, but everything else is just improving. You know, visual effects and destruction and all kind of stuff, I feel like we're getting pretty desensitized to it all. We watch San Andreas or Independence Day or whatever the next one is, and it's just like, this is too much. Like I remember working on Transformers, and I was dating this girl at the time, and I remember nudging her like, oh yeah, I did this this bit where these buildings all blew up. And then like a minute later, I'm like, wait, no, I did this. I couldn't even tell my own work from someone else's, just because it's just so much overload of explosions and destruction. Like, it all looked the same to me, and I'd been staring at that shot for weeks. And I think that says a lot. Like, for me, it was a bit of a realization, like, wow, like there's just so much crap on screen. And that's what I do for a living, is make this crap. But what I think is really inspiring is when you see these movies where, you know, we're having lunch or breakfast earlier, and we're talking about Revenant, and I was thinking how so many people are going to leave that movie being like, that's a real movie, you know, you don't need the CGI crap, you know. And that entire movie, if you watch the credits, it was like 10 minutes of just credits, because the whole movie is stitched shot by shot by shot, all these different performances, all these different things, and obviously the bear and all these other bits that were huge, but the movie itself is just a gigantic CGI, you know, CGI porn fest of stuff. And but that's the thing, is like, now we're able to have these tools that allow us to do amazing films, rather than it being like, all right, come see the twister, come see the asteroid. You know, it's now, come see a movie where we're able to bring all this technology seamlessly in that allows us to enjoy the film better and tell the stories that weren't possible 10 years ago.